Nile flows not just with water, but with memory, for over 3,000 years. Its banks bore witness to a civilization that sculpted gods from stone and kings from dust. And among them, one name endures, etched deeper into time than even the pyramids he gazed upon with awe. Ramesses II, pharaoh, warrior, builder, living god to some. He was the golden boy of Egypt's might, the child groomed by greatness, raised in a palace where gods and kings dined in shadowed halls of incense and sandstone. To others, he was myth incarnate, the man who fought nations, built temples that could command the sun, and reigned so long that his sons died waiting. But who was he, truly? This is not a tale of dry bones and broken statues. It is a walk along, riverbanks still humming with prayers to Amen. It is the clatter of chariots on the plains of Kadesh. It is the quiet heartbeat of a god-king as twilight nears and the breath of the desert cools. Join us as we unravel the mystery and majesty of a man who tried to defy time and nearly did. Soft call to action, and if by the end you feel a little closer to eternity, that's just Ramesses whispering across the sands. The desert air was dry, but not silent. Somewhere near the banks of the Nile, in a palace shaded by date palms and cooled with woven linen, a child opened his eyes to the world, not as an ordinary boy, but as the heir to Egypt's divine bloodline. His name was Ramesses, son of Seti, child of Ra, a boy whose destiny had already been etched in stone before his first cry echoed across the golden halls of Ramesses. Even as a child, he was not treated as mortal. Nurses bowed, priests whispered. Hymns, statues of gods, glimmering in sun-soaked chambers, seemed to watch him grow, patient, expectant. He was tutored in hieroglyphs before he learned to speak in full sentences, taught to draw a bow by men who had drawn theirs in defense of the gods themselves. While other boys played in the mud by the river, Ramesses practiced walking like a king, one measured step at a time, the weight of eternity settling on his shoulders. Seti I, his father, was no ordinary ruler. Stern but visionary, Seti had carved Egypt's power into the Levant and left his mark on sacred temples and royal hearts. He saw in Ramesses not just a son, but a legacy, a bridge between the mortal and the divine. So, when the boy was barely in his teens, he was made co-regent, not merely a prince in name, but a pharaoh in waiting, a living shadow of Seti's ambition. The palace at Ramesses was no less grand than his destiny. Massive stone colonnades rose like frozen waves above, lotus-filled courtyards. The scent of myrrh and blue lotus clung to the cool corridors where scribes hurried and viziers bowed. And in the heart of it all, the young prince, dressed in linen and gold, his eyes already learning how to scan a room like a ruler, not a child. His mother Tuya played a gentler role. In her presence, Ramesses could still be a boy, even if only briefly. It was she who whispered stories of the gods into his ears, teaching him that kingship was not just rule, but ritual. Not just control, but care. To command the Nile, she would say softly, you must first know its rhythm. As he grew, so too did his legend. He rode chariots by moonlight, flanked by his half-brothers and trusted generals. He practiced swordplay with real blades, drawing real blood, under the watchful eye of veterans who remembered Egypt's battles against the sea peoples. By the time he was 15, Ramesses was taller than most, with a profile already etched into amulets. and temple walls. He had the bearing of a hawk, sharp, regal, alert, and the people began to whisper, not if, but when. Yet beyond the ceremonies and polished public face, there were moments of silence where the boy behind the crown caught his reflection in still water and wondered, what does it mean to be chosen? Did the gods truly breathe through his lips? Or was it just incense, illusion, an inherited myth? Such doubts, though fleeting, never left him. For a king to rule without question, he had to silence his own. And so, Ramesses learned not only the art of governance and war, but the craft of performance. He understood that the crown was not simply worn, it was inhabited. The pharaoh was more than a man. He was Egypt made flesh. When Seti grew older, slower, Ramesses stood closer to the throne. He led military campaigns under his fathers. Name, inspected monuments, half-built, and promised more. He began choosing his inner circle, the advisors, commanders, and artisans who would follow him into a reign that would span over 6 decades. But power never comes without cost. Behind closed doors, palace politics slithered like desert snakes. There were those who whispered that Ramesses was too young, too idealistic, too eager to outshine his father. Old priests who clung to tradition, courtiers who remembered other sons, other claims. Ramesses listened, and then he built, even before Seti's death. Ramesses began commissioning monuments, his name carved side by side with his father's. He wanted the world to see what was coming. Not just continuity, but crescendo. Not succession, but transcendence. And when the day came, when Seti finally passed into the field of reeds, Ramesses stood before the people of Egypt, not as a boy grown into a man, but as a man grown into a myth. He wore the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. He held the crook and flail, ancient symbols of kingship. But most of all, he bore a presence, the kind that silences rooms, that bends air, that convinces even the most skeptical eye that gods do walk among men. The sun beat down on Ramesses that morning, and as the new pharaoh raised his arms to the heavens, somewhere in some corner of a dusty temple, a scribe began to carve the opening lines of a new chapter in Egyptian history. Ramesses the Great. The crown sat heavy, not just in weight, but in memory. Ramesses stood in the house of millions of years, the temple of eternity his father, Seti, had begun in the west bank of Thebes. The incense hung like mist, curling around painted pillars that told stories in pigment and prayer. Before him, the sarcophagus of Seti, carved with spells from the Book of the Dead, glowed in the dim torchlight. Here lay the man who taught him to be a king. And now, Egypt belonged to the boy he had raised. But what does a young pharaoh inherit, truly? Not merely land or stone, nor just titles. Ramesses inherited time itself, our 1.5-year-old empire weathered by floods and famine, gods and grievances. He inherited the Nile, its blessings, its betrayals, and a people both devout and weary, loyal and watchful. He inherited a vision etched in the hearts of generations, that Egypt was eternal, and the king its anchor. Ramesses was 19. Yet he did not tremble. Instead, he marched forward. The coronation was a symphony of spectacle, priests in gold-threaded robes, chants rising like the wind through sycamores, flowers crushed beneath sandaled feet. The double crown was placed on his brow, the false beard tied beneath his chin, and the ritual names were spoken. 5 titles, 5 aspects of divinity. In that moment, Ramesses ceased to be just a man. He became Nesabit, the living Horus, the son of Ra, the god on earth, and he believed it, or taught himself to believe it. But Egypt was not a still lake. Beneath its calm surface, currents swirled to the north. The Hittites watched, waiting. Across the Red Sea, Nubian chiefs tested their chains. Inside the palaces of Memphis and Thebes, bureaucrats whispered and nobles measured their steps, wondering whether this young king would hold or shatter beneath the weight of his inheritance. Ramesses answered with stone. He began building immediately, temples, obelisks, entire cities, not as vanity, but as message. Every carved lintel was a proclamation, every colossal statue a promise. He expanded Ramesses into a glittering capital, a city of chariots and lotus ponds, of fan-bearers and festival halls. The walls were painted in ochre and blue, images of the kings smiting enemies, feeding gods, embracing the sun. This was not the arrogance of youth, it was strategy. In Egypt, stone was the language of legitimacy. Pharaohs ruled with granite, but it was not stone alone that proved his worth. Ramesses took command of Egypt's armies, not as a distant monarch, but as a general in bronze, breastplate gleaming beneath the desert sun. He led campaigns into Qanon, pacified rebellious vassals, and pushed the borders of empire with the relentlessness of a rising tide. He rode in his chariot like a falcon in flight, fast, graceful, deadly. His soldiers loved him, not just for victory, but for presence. Where other kings delegated, Ramesses stood among them. He ate with them beneath tamarisk trees, listened to their songs, wept over the bodies of the fallen. He was a god, yes, but also a comrade. In one campaign through Syria, he marched over 400 miles with the army. Dust clung to his face. His lips cracked beneath the desert wind, and still he rode. For Ramesses knew that to be immortal, in Egypt, one must first live entirely in the now. Back home, the temples multiplied. Karnak echoed with hammer and chisel, stone vibrating with praise. Statues of the king rose beside the gods, their proportions equal, their features nearly identical. To the eyes of the faithful, the message was clear. Ra walked among them, and his name was Ramesses. He took wives, as kings did. Many, but one held a place higher than all others, Nefertari. Her beauty was renowned, but it was her mind that captivated. She could read hieroglyphs, compose prayers, and advise in council. Ramesses honored her with a temple of her own at Abu Simbel, rare, sacred, and carved with the same care as those for the gods. Together, they became Egypt's golden pair, the pharaoh and his beloved, the sun and the star it chose to follow. Yet, beneath all triumphs lay the old enemy of kings, time. Ramesses had inherited a kingdom both proud and precarious. Seti had stabilized the empire, but scars remained. Grain stores could vanish with a single failed flood. The priesthood of Ammon wielded power enough to rival the crown. And the memory of Akhenaten, the heretic king who worshipped only one god, still lingered like smoke in temple courtyards. Ramesses would not erase the past. Instead, he would build over it. Temples restored, gods placated, festivals revived. He turned Egypt not away from its traditions, but deeper into them, with him as their living proof. He wrote himself into the cosmos. On every wall he was there, giving offerings to Ptah, embracing Isis, kneeling before Ra. He was the story told at every solstice festival, the name on every priest's tongue. A man so present that his absence would one day feel like a collapse. But with power came solitude. On quiet nights, beneath canopies of woven reeds, he may have stared into the fire and felt the silence stretch. Not even a king can command time to pause, and in his mind the question may have returned. The one from boyhood. What does it mean to be chosen? Perhaps it meant giving everything. Sleep, safety, even truth to rule Egypt was to vanish into symbol, to become the statue while still alive. Smiling, silent, eternal. But if that was the price of glory, Ramesses would pay it in full. For his was not a reign meant to last decades. It was meant to echo forever. Stone does not forget. In the ancient heart of Egypt, where the sun filters through high columns like liquid gold, Ramesses the Great began to etch his soul into eternity. His reign would not be remembered merely for battles or treaties, but for the towering dreams he carved from limestone and granite. He did not build as men build. He built as gods remember. In Thebes, the sacred city of Ammon, the temples stirred once more. At Karnak, where centuries of kings had added their mark like layers in a hymn, Ramesses stepped into the lineage of divine architects. Columns already older than dynasties were joined by new ones, thicker, higher, aligned with the light of the solstice. The reliefs grew more intricate, the gods more generous, and always the king's face, calm, commanding, stared back from the stone. Lips curled into the serene confidence of someone who knew he would outlive time. But Karnak was only the beginning. Ramesses turned south, toward the cliffs above the Nile near Nubia, toward Abu Simbel. Here the mountain faced the dawn, remote and unspoiled. And it was here that the pharaoh dreamed of a monument not just to his reign, but to his place among the divine. A temple that would not merely honor the gods, but claim their reflection. A temple to startle the sun itself. The project began with silence. Stonecutters arrived first, their chisels echoing like distant thunder across the sandstone cliffs. Then architects, priests, engineers, hundreds of laborers. They brought scaffolds of acacia wood, baskets for sand, ropes twisted from papyrus and palm. No blueprint existed, only vision, ritual, and command. The faces came last. For colossi, each towering over 20 meters, carved directly into the cliff face. 4 identical images of the king, seated, serene, crowned with the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, eyes like still water, hands resting on knees. The statues watched the desert with the patience of eternity, and when the sun rose, it bowed twice a year at the equinoxes, its rays pierced through the mountain temple, illuminating the inner sanctum where Ramesses sat beside Amun-Ra, Rehorekti, and Ptah. It was not accident. It was choreography, solar, sacred, sublime. But Abu Simbel was not merely engineering. It was faith rendered massive, a kind of holy arrogance, not to defy nature, but to shape it, to make even the sun a witness to Egypt's might. He built not just for gods, but for love. Beside the great temple, another was carved, smaller, gentler, but no less powerful. This was the Temple of Nefertari, not merely a queen's shrine, but an unprecedented tribute. Her image adorned the facade beside the king's own, her divinity affirmed in sculpture, rare, radical, and perhaps romantic. For whom the sun shines, one inscription reads, "She lives." Yet not all temples were so distant. In Luxor, Ramesses added new courts, new colonnades, his name threaded through chants and columns like a refrain. In Memphis, he erected obelisks that sliced the sky, each weighing more than 100 tons, hauled by hundreds across miles of sand. In Heliopolis, the city of the sun, his presence grew taller than stories. To build was to rule, not because monuments controlled people, but because they made belief visible. In the age before books, it was walls that spoke, and Ramesses made them sing. He told stories of conquest, of order, of cosmic balance. Stories where Egypt always triumphed, where chaos was always subdued, where Ramesses stood between the world and its undoing. And the people believed, because when they walked beneath stone lotus capitals 50 feet high, when they saw the kings, figures smiting enemies who threatened Mat, the sacred order, when the drums of the Opet festival echoed through the avenue of sphinxes, they didn't see politics, they saw permanence. Ramesses became not just king, but concept. His temples blurred the line between worship and propaganda. Each statue bore his likeness, each relief his legend. He was the giver of breath, the slayer of darkness, the one who tamed the Nile. It mattered little that the truth was more complicated. In Egypt, myth was more powerful than fact. Even the workers, the stonemasons and overseers, left behind graffiti, scratched in half-hidden corners. We carved for the glory of the king, one reads. Another, he builds like the sun. Rises, they were proud, exhausted, devoted, and Ramesses rewarded them. Grain rations, feasts, holidays. He knew that to build forever, one must also build loyalty. Still, the scale of construction was staggering. Over 30 temples bear his name. Dozens of statues, some still standing, some broken but unbowed. Reliefs stretching hundreds of meters, all unified not just by style, but by message. Egypt is strong, its gods are present, and Ramesses is their chosen voice. But even as he built, he watched out to the north. Tensions simmered. The Hittite Empire, proud and growing, eyed Egypt's lands in Syria. A clash loomed, a confrontation not of temples, but of swords, and Ramesses, ever the builder, began preparing not just walls, but armies. The chariots were restored. The bronze was sharpened. Egypt's legions, Medjay archers, Nubian auxiliaries, chariot corps of Ramesses gathered under banners that bore the king's name in gold dot. Abu Simbel would not be enough. Stone alone could not hold an empire. But before the march to war, Ramesses stood once more before the statues he had carved from the mountain, for faces of himself silent in the dawn. He looked up, perhaps searching for an answer, or simply listening. As the sun crowned the eastern horizon and light poured into the sanctum, illuminating gods carved in flesh and stone, he smiled. Because in that moment, in light, silence, and vision, the dream was real. He had become part of the mountain. It began not with war cries, but with tension to the north. Beyond Egypt's traditional reach, the Hittite Empire had grown bold. In the dusty valleys of Syria, in cities whose names cracked like dry branches, Aleppo, Carchemish, Tunip, loyalties shifted like the wind. Egypt's control frayed, tribute grew sparse, and behind it all loomed one city like a whispered threat. Kadesh. Kadesh was no mere outpost. It was a symbol. It controlled the Orontes River, a lifeline through the Levant. Whoever held Kadesh held influence, trade, and military passage. Egypt had claimed it. The Hittites had taken it. And now Ramesses wanted it back. But more than that, he needed it. He had built temples that touched the clouds, monuments that defied decay. But none of it meant anything if his borders fell like papyrus in the rain. His legacy was not just in stone, but an empire. And so he prepared to strike. The year was still early. The Nile had not yet risen. The army moved north in 4 divisions: Amen, Ra, Pata, and Set. Each bore the name of a god, each carried by thousands of men, archers, infantry, charioteers. Dust spiraled in their wake, drums pounded, standards fluttered. At their head rode the pharaoh, Ramesses in his war chariot, sleek, fast flanked by elite guards. His armor shimmered with bronze scale, his eyes sharp beneath the blue war crown. To his troops, he was more than mortal. He was a divine hawk, soaring above the dust, furious, focused, unblinking. But war, as it often does, began with a lie. Near Kadesh, 2 men were captured. Hittite spies. They told Ramesses what he wanted to hear: that Muwatalli, the Hittite king, had retreated, that the city was poorly defended, that now was the time to strike. Ramesses believed them. He split his forces. He pressed forward with the Amen division, far ahead of the others, eager to seize Kadesh before the enemy regrouped. His chariot wheels carved furrows in the earth, his soldiers marching under a burning sun, spirits high. Then the ground shifted beneath them, not literally, but in truth. Muwatalli had not retreated. He was waiting, hidden behind the hills. With over 35,000 men, chariots in the thousands, elite warriors, archers, spearmen, all concealed. Like a cobra beneath sand, they struck the Ra division first. It was ambushed, caught in the open. Chaos erupted, shouting, trampling, blades flashing in confusion. The Ra division, unprepared, scattered. Survivors fled in all directions, some toward Ramesses, others away from the carnage. The desert was filled with screams and dust. Ramesses was isolated, vulnerable. He stood at the head of a single division, his enemies pouring in. The Hittites were closing, their chariots fast and lethal. Victory seemed impossible. Even survival seemed distant. And yet, in that moment, the myth became real. Ramesses did not retreat. He mounted his chariot and rode straight into the fray, not in desperation, but in defiance. His horses lunged, his arrows flew. He called out to Amen, not in private prayer, but in thunderous appeal. "Where are you, my father? Do I not walk in your image?" The line held. With the arrival of the Pata division and auxiliary forces from Amaru, the tide turned. Egyptian soldiers, emboldened by the sight of their king battling like a storm incarnate, pushed back. The Hittites were forced to retreat. Across the Orontes, their momentum broken. It was not conquest. Kadesh was not taken, but it was not defeat. Ramesses had survived, and in surviving, he had won something rarer than territory. He had won legend. Back in Egypt, the story was carved. In every major temple, on the walls of Luxor, Abu Simbel and Karnak, the tale unfolded like epic poetry. Ramesses, alone, surrounded, betrayed, yet triumphant. Images showed him firing arrows from his chariot, slaying thousands, trampling enemies beneath the hooves of divine horses. The truth was less clean. The battle was likely a draw, both sides claiming advantage, neither achieving total victory. But in the world of pharaohs, truth bent to eternity. For Egypt's people, it was enough. Their king had faced the storm and returned in one inscription. The king speaks directly to the reader. Not one of you, my soldiers, my captains, my charioteers, stood and fought. But I did. I stood alone, and I brought back the day. Was it bravado? Perhaps. Was it performance? Undoubtedly, but it worked. Ramesses didn't need the facts. He had the story. And stories, in Egypt, lasted longer than kingdoms. Still, the cost lingered. Thousands of men never returned from Kadesh. Their names uncarved. Their bones buried beneath sands that bore no witness. Ramesses honored them in his own way, with monuments, festivals, feasts. But the weight of their loss followed him in quiet moments, perhaps. He remembered their faces, the boy who handed him water on campaign, the officer who taught him to ride, the foot soldier who smiled just before the ambush struck. Kings cannot afford sentiment, but they can carry it. And so Ramesses rode home to Ramesses, to the temples, to Nefertari, and beneath the arches of victory, the memory of that battle echoed, not just for its blood, but for its clarity. In war, he had been tested, not as a god, but as a man. And in standing alone, he had not found glory. He had found himself. Victory in Egypt was written in stone. But in Hattusa, the Hittite capital, the scars of Kadesh were not carved, they were buried. Muwatalli, the Hittite king who had dared to defy Ramesses, did not live long after the battle. His brother, Hattusili, would rise in his place, and the winds across the Near East would shift once again. The world was changing, even empires. Those grand illusions of permanence had to adapt. Years passed. Ramesses grew, older, wiser, more deliberate. His hair, once the deep black of coal, was touched now with threads of silver. But his gaze, sharp as obsidian, remained fixed on the horizon. Egypt was stable, secure. The temples gleamed. The Nile was kind. Yet in the north, the Hittites had not vanished. They too had endured. What came next was not a conquest, but something far rarer in the age of swords. A treaty. It was a parchment moment in a world of bronze, fragile, deliberate, transformative. Envoys arrived in Ramesses, bearing gifts and guarded words. Their clothing smelled of cedar and foreign incense, their language thick with the cadence of distant hills. They met not only with scribes, but with the Pharaoh himself. Imagine the chamber, cool stone underfoot, columns wrapped in painted lotus, and between them a king and his enemies, seated not in armor, but in compromise. The Treaty of Kadesh, as history would name it, was more than ink on parchment. It was the world's first known peace accord. Two superpowers, Egypt and the Hittites, agreeing not to conquer, but to coexist. The language was formal, ornate, layered with ceremony. Each side swore to respect borders, to return fugitives, to defend one another from outside threats. It was not merely truce, but trust, or at least the illusion of it. And Ramesses, he signed it with the calm of a man who had seen too much war to worship it. On the walls of Karnak and the temples of Thebes, the treaty was inscribed in stone, not hidden in archives, but offered to the gods. That too was strategy, to show his people not that he had relented, but that he had ruled through wisdom. That peace, like war, could be worn as a crown. The language was mirrored, one copy in Egyptian, one in Hittite, each side promising not only to halt conflict, but to acknowledge the other as worthy of dignity. It was unprecedented. And then alliance deepened. In time, Ramesses married a Hittite princess, Nefer. Her name, reshaped by Egyptian tongue, meant she who sees the beauty of Ra. She arrived in grand procession, chariots glinting in the sun, music rising through palm-lined avenues, her foreign gods tucked carefully among the sacred cargo. It was not just a marriage, it was a statement that the blood of enemies could become the bond of nations. In the festivals that followed, Egypt rejoiced. Dancers painted in ochre and white spun beneath papyrus garlands. Wine flowed like river water, and Ramesses, seated beside his foreign queen, lifted a golden cup not to conquest, but to continuity. Peace had come, not as a whisper, but as an empire's new song. And yet, it was not without irony. Ramesses, who had once carved his valor into every wall, was now celebrated for not fighting. The king who claimed the field of Kadesh now claimed its peace. And in that peace, he found something rarer than fame. He found breath, no longer consumed by campaigns. He turned inward to Egypt's soul. Trade flourished, art revived. The priesthood of Ammon, long dormant under suspicious kings, now grew. In confidence, temples were expanded. The cult of the living pharaoh deepened, stretching into festival and feast. Ramesses didn't rule with absence, he ruled with presence. He appeared at processions draped in white linen, carrying the scepter of kingship and the ankh of eternal life. He led rituals in the temple of Luxor, stood before statues of gods as though greeting old friends, and presided over the said festival, the great jubilee that declared a king's strength renewed on in one mural. He is shown running, yes running, in a ritual race, barefoot in the sand. He was no longer a boy, but he proved himself still king. Not through war, not through stone, but through endurance. And the people believed, because belief is not just ritual, it is repetition. And Ramesses repeated himself brilliantly, not in redundancy, but in rhythm. The rhythm of rule, of peace, of performance that became truth. Even foreign scribes took notice. Letters between courts spoke of the great pharaoh with deference. Trade envoys brought not only cedar and copper, but admiration. Egypt stood as the sun, constant, distant, illuminating, and Ramesses, he stood at its center. He had fought and he had bargained. He had ruled with fire, and now he ruled with light. Yet beneath it all, he understood, peace is not the absence of danger, it is the choice to look beyond it. He had given Egypt more than expansion. He had given it time, time for children to grow without fear, time for temples to rise without threat, time for stories, his stories to be told in calm voices by flickering lamps, not shouted over clashing blades. And in the hush that followed the treaty, as reeds swayed on the banks of the Nile, the old soldier became something rarer still. A king who outlasted his battles. A ruler whose greatest victory was the one he did not need to win. In Egypt, the divine was not distant. The gods walked in shadowed corridors. They flickered in lamplight. They whispered in the rustling reeds of the Nile and thundered in the silence of tombs. For the Egyptians' faith was not belief, it was certainty. And at the heart of that certainty stood one man, Ramesses Pharaoh, mediator, God incarnate. His image was carved beside Ammon, painted beside Ra, seated among Osiris and Horus as though a peer. But these were not the boasts of a madman. They were the truths of a people whose king was not elected, but born of divine right. Ramesses had been raised within the breath of the gods. As a child, he watched priests anoint altars and light sacred oils in rooms thick with incense. He learned that to rule Egypt was not just to command armies, but to maintain Ma at the cosmic balance, order over chaos, harmony over havoc. A king who failed Mat doomed his people. The floods would falter, crops would wither, the sun might even stall. It was not a metaphor, it was the law of the world. And so Ramesses served, even as he reigned. He presided over rituals at Karnak, where the temple of Ammon rose like a man-made forest. Columns soared above him, each as wide as a house, as tall. As a cedar, he moved through them like a priest and a god both. At each festival, he renewed the bond between heaven and earth, reciting prayers older than pyramids. He performed the opening of the mouth for statues, not just of the gods, but of himself. He gave voice to stone, gave breath to the eternal. To outsiders, it may have seemed blasphemy, but to Egypt, it was necessary. The king was a conduit, a vessel. Without him, the sun might not rise, and Ramesses understood the weight of that expectation. So, he did not shrink from it. He embraced it. He lived not one life, but two. One mortal, one divine. The mortal, Ramesses wore linen, ate figs, argued with advisors. But the divine Ramesses stood in temples, built to echo thunder, offering incense. Two deities who stared back at him with falcon eyes. He knelt before statues. Yes, but he also joined them. His cartouche was etched into the sanctuaries of countless gods, Amun, Pathoth, Hathor, not intruding, but coexisting. He was never above the gods, but he was always near. He ruled. With them in the grand hyperstyle hall at Karnak, his name is cut into stone like a heartbeat, repetitive, essential. His triumphs over chaos, carved again and again, not to boast, but to remind. Without Ramesses, the world unraveled, and yet, for all his power, he still prayed. He stood in the sanctuary of Ra at Heliopolis, the birthplace of the sun, where light touched the first obelisk of morning. He bowed before the sacred barks, golden shrines carried through the streets by priests, their veils hiding the presence of Ammon as he toured his earthly domain. He wept at tombs. He whispered to the sky, because deep down, even a god-king knew his limits. Storms came unbidden. Plagues whispered through granaries. Children died. Priests interpreted dreams, and Ramesses listened, not with fear, but with respect. To rule Egypt was to accept mystery, to stand at the threshold of certainty and step into shadow. He funded temples across the empire, not out of vanity, but to feed the sacred, to keep the rituals alive, to employ hundreds of priests, dancers, singers, scribes. They were the heartbeat of the realm. Without them, Egypt fell silent. At Abu Simbel, he carved himself beside the gods and made offerings in stone that would outlast even his bones. The temple was not just a monument to himself, it was a message. Ramesses is not a rival of the gods, he is their echo. Even in death, the divine relationship continued. His tomb, deep in the Valley of the Kings, was painted with spells and prayers. The Book of the Dead lined its walls, guiding him not just through eternity, but through judgment. Even the great king would stand before Osiris one day, heart weighed against the feather of Mat, because in Egypt, divinity did not excuse. It demanded more. And Ramesses accepted that, lived it, became it. One hymn, etched into a temple wall, calls him the son of Ra, beloved of Mat, who makes the gods rejoice. But what does it mean to be beloved of gods? It means to give, to bleed, to sacrifice the personal for the eternal. He did not know anonymity. He could never truly rest. Even his joy was ritual, and perhaps, in the long, silent corridors of his palace beneath ceilings painted like stars, he wondered who he was when no eyes watched, when no incense burned, when he was not Pharaoh, not son of Ra, just a man. But those moments were rare. Most days, he rose before dawn, offered prayers to the rising sun, met with priests, judged disputes, read reports, commissioned temples, and walked the line between man and myth with steady steps. He had become what Egypt needed, a god who knew the dust beneath his feet. And when the people saw his likeness, not in flesh, but in statues, towering above markets and roads, they did not see arrogance, they saw security. The gods had not abandoned them. They were still here, wearing the face of Ramesses. In a world of conquest and stone, love blooms quietly, not with banners or trumpets, but with soft glances in incense-lit chambers, with the brush of linen in a colonnade, the hush of laughter behind a veil, even for a king, a god in flesh. There are moments when the heart speaks louder than the throne. For Ramesses, that voice had a name, Nefertari. She was more than consort, more than symbol. In an empire built on ritual and hierarchy, she was an equal in spirit, and sometimes, in state from the beginning, her presence unsettled expectation. She was not chosen for lineage alone. She was chosen for brilliance. Her eyes, they said, held the depth of the Nile at flood. Her voice, low and steady, could hush courtly rooms. But it was her mind that caught fire in the palace. She was educated, literate in hieroglyphs, fluent in diplomacy, trusted in council, in official records. Her title was spoken with reverence, the great royal wife, mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt, lady of all lands, for whom the sun shines. Ramesses loved many. He had wives, concubines, an ever-growing brood of sons and daughters. Royal bloodlines were, after all, a matter of state as much as passion. But Nefertari was different. With her, he carved not just monuments, but memory. On the cliffs at Abu Simbel, beside the towering temple to himself, he carved a second shrine. Smaller in scale, but in meaning, unmeasurable. 6 statues stood on the facade, 4 of him, 2 of her, equal in height, equal in permanence. Inside, scenes of Nefertari offering to Isis, goddess of magic and motherhood. Nefertari crowned with plumes, adorned in divine regalia, and above it all, words carved in devotion. She for whom the sun rises. In a kingdom of gods, that was no small thing. But her influence reached beyond stone. In the early years of Ramesses' reign, Nefertari accompanied him on diplomatic missions, wrote letters to foreign queens, and hosted emissaries in the palace. Gardens of Ramesses. She understood the subtle politics of grace, the way a gesture, a word, a carefully timed silence could bend empires more gently than war. And Ramesses trusted her, not out of necessity, but admiration. They moved through palace halls, not as ruler and subject, but as two minds sharing the same vision. During festivals, she stood beside him, her hand wrapped in his, her gaze fixed on the gods they both served and became. She bore him children, princes with the sharp eyes of their father, daughters with the poise of their mother. And though many children followed from other wives, the ones born of Nefertari held a particular place in the king's heart. But love, like life, is not immune to time. Somewhere deep in Ramesses' reign, after the 15th year, perhaps the 20th, Nefertari faded from the records. The precise cause is unknown. Illness, most likely. Not treachery, not neglect. Just the quiet cruelty of mortality. Her death was not shouted in inscriptions. It was whispered in absence. But Ramesses did not forget her. He built her a tomb in the Valley of the Queens, one of the most breathtaking ever crafted. Hidden in the Theban hills, it opens like a secret. Inside, the walls are painted in celestial blue and radiant gold. Stars glimmer on the ceilings. Gods guide her soul through the afterlife. Isis embraces her. Hathor welcomes her. And Ramesses, though not depicted, is present in every stroke of care. This was no mere resting place. It was a love letter in color and silence. And through it, Nefertari lived. Even today, her tomb speaks. The paint has faded, the dust has gathered. But her story endures, not because of the crown she wore, but because of the man who refused to let the world forget her. Ramesses would go on. He would marry again, including a Hittite princess, Mother Nefer, a union of peace rather than passion. He would father over 100 children. His court would swell with queens, daughters, grandsons. But in the sacred halls of memory, Nefertari remained untouched. She was not just a queen, she was a myth within a myth. The woman who walked beside the sun and cast no shadow, and perhaps, in his later years, when the chariot rides grew slower, and the priest's hymns more fragile, Ramesses would slip away to the tombs, to her tomb, not as Pharaoh, not as God, but as a man who once loved fiercely in a world that rarely allowed tenderness, and perhaps, just perhaps, he would whisper into the stillness, for whom the sun rises, it never sets. At midday, the Nile glows like polished obsidian. Its current moves with purpose, not hurried, not still, as if carrying the weight of a civilization that believed time itself was cyclical. Along its fertile banks, cities bloomed like lilies. Marketplaces hummed with breath and bronze, and temple walls caught the sunlight like mirrors for the gods. This was Egypt under Ramesses II, at the height of its power, an empire not simply ruled but curated. Decades had passed since his coronation. Ramesses was no longer a boy king, nor even the tireless warrior of Kadesh. He was now the living monument, a ruler whose reign outlasted rivals, generations, and nearly belief itself. A man who had been king longer than many Egyptians had been alive. And in that reign, Egypt flourished. Trade flowed like floodwaters, not of chaos, but abundance. Caravans wound their way through the desert, bringing turquoise from Sinai, cedar from Lebanon, ivory from Nubia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Along the docks of Ramesses, the great delta capital, ships from distant lands unloaded amphorae of wine, ingots of copper, bolts of linen, and stories in tongues foreign but fascinated. Ramesses itself had become a marvel, a city of broad avenues, ceremonial lakes, colossal statues, and bustling workshops. Its walls echoed not just with royal decrees, but with the laughter of children, the calls of merchants, and the clang of bronze on anvil. Ramesses had made his capital a reflection of his rule, grand, ordered, enduring. temples dominated the skyline, not only to Ammon or Ra, but to himself. The cult of the living pharaoh reached its zenith. Priests recited hymns in which his name was spoken beside the gods. His festivals were nationwide, the Sed festivals, especially, celebrating his rejuvenation as both king and divine figure. During those great jubilees, Ramesses appeared as a god reborn, wrapped in white, carrying the flail and crook, running ritual laps before the people, proving his eternal strength. It was not performance. It was affirmation. Egypt believed. And through belief, Egypt held. The army was strong, not always at war, but always ready. Chariot divisions trained in the desert, their wheels spinning like clockwork. The Medjay elite desert warriors patrolled borders, fortresses. Along the Levant kept watchful eyes toward the east, even in peace. And within the court, his sons took up arms and titles. Kimus at the scholar prince, restored ancient tombs and revived the names of forgotten kings. Meneptah, his eventual successor, stood at his father's side in diplomacy and ritual. Others led campaigns or governed provinces, their roles vital yet always orbiting the sun that was Ramesses. Even in domestic life, the empire glistened. Artisans worked under royal patronage to produce jewelry, statues, and murals of extraordinary finesse. The tombs in the Valley of the Kings became deeper, more intricate, their ceilings studded with constellations and spells. Scribes copied texts by the hundreds, not only sacred incantations, but stories, wisdom literature, love poems. One such poem, possibly composed in his reign, reads, "My love is one with the lotus. When she walks, the stars follow," a line worthy of Nefertari, a line that belonged in an age when Egypt had time for poetry. Because Egypt was not merely rich, it was stable, and that, in the ancient world, was as rare as gold. Other powers faltered. The Mycenaeans struggled. The Assyrians rose too soon and burned out. But Egypt, beneath Ramesses, stood like a mountain, unmoved, unshaken. Foreign dignitaries came to marvel. Some brought gifts, others brought daughters. Treaties were renewed. The peace held, and still Ramesses built new temples, new statues, new narratives in stone. Not for vanity, but for continuity. He understood that a ruler must not only act in his own time, but speak to the ones that follow. So he wrote himself into history with a mason's hand and a prophet's clarity. On the temple walls, the world was orderly. The Nile flowed. The gods smiled. The enemies bowed. And at the center stood Ramesses, unaging, untouched. But even as the empire glowed, shadows stretched long. Climate patterns shifted. Grain yields occasionally faltered. Far-off peoples, the Libyans, the sea peoples, stirred restlessly. These were not yet threats, but omens. Ramesses, ever the strategist, watched. He strengthened supply lines, fortified outer provinces, stockpiled grain. Egypt would not be caught unready, not while he ruled. And he still ruled, year after year, festival after festival. His reign endured. 20 years, 30, 40 more. His subjects were born, lived, and died, all under his name. Children learned to speak while watching their parents bow to the same king who would still be alive. When they had children of their own, he became less a man, more a force of nature. In the tales told beside hearthfires, Ramesses was not only the king, he was the king, the one who had always been, the one who always would be. And yet, deep within the palace walls, perhaps even he wondered how. long can one man carry a kingdom? But the question did not slow him. He pressed on, not because he believed he was immortal, but because Egypt needed him to be. In truth, it had become impossible to imagine the world without him, and so the empire stood, tall, proud, glimmering, beneath the sun it had worshipped for millennia, held aloft by the will, wisdom, and weight of a single man, Ramesses, builder of monuments, keeper of peace, master of image and order, Pharaoh of the zenith. There comes a stillness before dusk, when the light softens, the wind quiets, and even the Nile seems to hesitate between breath and reflection. In those moments, eternity feels closer, and for Ramesses twilight arrived not in defeat, but in duration. He had reigned longer than any before him. 60 years, maybe more. The exact number mattered less than the immensity of it. Entire lifetimes passed beneath his crown. Egypt changed, and yet, somehow, he did not, or so the stories said. But these do not obey myths. The man who once led charges at Kadesh now walked more slowly. His once chiseled frame softened with age. His skin etched with the lines of thousands of decisions, thousands of days lived under the weight of divinity. His hair turned silver, then thin. His spine bent like a reed under years of ceremony, grief, and greatness. Yet still, he ruled. Each morning he emerged, draped in linen, girded in gold. His crook and flail symbols, now more than tools. He stood before priests who had once been boys, gave orders to sons who had once clung to his sandals. Time moved around him, but Ramesses remained the axis. In public, he smiled. In private, he may have sighed, because with longevity came sorrow. He buried queens. He buried sons. He buried heirs who had spent their lives waiting, only to pass before the throne ever left his hands. One by one, the princes of Ramesses' boys, raised to rule, vanished into the tombs their father had prepared for them. Kemwesit, the scholar prince, was mourned deeply. Others followed, and as the years stretched on, the line of succession shortened. Eventually, only one remained. Meneptah, his 13th son, by then an old man himself. It was a strange legacy, to live long enough that your grandchildren were the titles once meant for your children, to become a god who outlives his own dynasty. And still, Ramesses endured. The said festivals continued, perhaps not with running, but with presence. The statues multiplied, no longer to declare power, but to anchor memory. He watched his name ripple outward, not just across Egypt, but beyond, to the Levant, to the courts of Babylon, even to the early scrolls of the Hebrews. Some say he was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Others dispute it. But regardless of myth or record, one truth remained. Ramesses was unforgettable, and he seemed to know it. In his final decades, he turned increasingly toward legacy. He restored old temples, not of his own making, those of forgotten kings, buried gods, erased dynasties. He commissioned scribes to record the deeds of ancestors, not because he feared being forgotten, but because he understood the cost of being lost to time. He had walked through temples older than his own name. He had seen weather wear down stone, sand bury whole sanctuaries, names scratched away by time or politics. He would not let that happen to Egypt, and so his hand shaped more than statues. It shaped memory. He became, in many ways, the empire's final echo of greatness, before a long, slow twilight. After him, Egypt would fracture, strain, diminish, not collapse, not at once, but it would never again shine quite as it had in those long golden years beneath the steady gaze of Ramesses still. Even gods must sleep. He died quietly, perhaps in the palace at Ramesses, perhaps elsewhere. The records, so meticulous in life, turn vague in death, as if the scribes themselves could not bear to write it down. The king was gone, but he did not vanish. His mummified body was placed in a richly decorated tomb in the Valley of the Kings KV7, near the resting places of ancestors and allies. Painted spells lined the walls, guiding him through the duat, the underworld. Amulets protected him. Priests recited incantations to ease his journey toward the stars, and Egypt paused, not in chaos, but in reverence, because something vast had ended. Ramesses had not just been a king, he had been the measure of kingship. The weight of him, not just in flesh or crown, but in presence, was immense. And now that weight was gone. The temples still stood. The statues still loomed. But the man who had made Egypt feel endless was no longer walking its sacred earth. Still, he had done what few ever could. He had passed into story while still alive, and now into silence. Without vanishing, he had built a world that could remember. In the decades to follow, Egypt would change. The capital would move. Foreign powers would rise. But Ramesses remained in stone, in scroll, in memory. Children would learn to write by copying his name. Pilgrims would whisper prayers beneath his statues. And in the Valley of the Kings, the wind would move through the cliffs as it always had, steady, solemn, eternal, like him, like the god who grew old. In Egypt, death was never an ending. It was a passage, a shift in light, a doorway between worlds. For the pharaohs, especially, the afterlife was not a distant hope. It was a destination, a place meticulously prepared, stocked with offerings, protected by spells, guarded by gods with jackal heads and sun discs for eyes. And Ramesses II, the king who had lived as a god, prepared accordingly. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings was vast, carved deep into the Theban cliffs. Its walls shimmered with blue and gold, celestial maps to guide his soul through the 12 gates of night. The Book of the Dead, the Book of Gates, the Litany of Ra, all were there, inscribed to ensure his rebirth in the field of reeds, the paradise beyond death. Priests laid him to rest with care. They wrapped him in linen soaked with resin, layered him in amulets. He was no longer Ramesses, he was Osiris, Ramesses, transformed, eternal. But Egypt, though ancient, is rarely still. Over centuries, tomb robbers came, earthquakes shifted, stone dynasties fell. The tombs of the pharaohs were violated, ransacked, stripped of their sacred silence. Ramesses' body, once laid to rest among stars and spells, was moved not once, but many times, by priests desperate to protect him. Eventually, he came to rest not in royal splendor, but in secrecy, hidden in a cache of mummies high. In the cliffs at Deir el-Bahari, tucked among other great kings, a quiet, crumbling archive of the divine. And there he lay, in darkness, for over 2,000 years, until he was found in 1881. A group of archaeologists, dusty, sunburnt, and wide-eyed, stumbled into history. Among the sarcophagi beneath the wrappings lay Ramesses II, They didn't know him at first, not truly, but the clues told the tale. The regal bearing, the inscriptions, the ancient bindings of authority. And when they unwrapped his face, gently, reverently, the world looked into the eyes of a man who had once ruled it. His features were still strong, the nose prominent, the jaw defined, his mouth curved slightly, eerily, into what looked almost like a knowing smile. The mummy of Ramesses was transported to Cairo, studied, preserved, and then something remarkable. In 1976, he was flown to Paris for conservation, not as cargo, but as royalty. The French government issued him a passport. Name, Ramesses II. Occupation, king, deceased. Nationality, Egyptian. He was greeted with military honors, 3,000 years dead and still. The world bowed, and labs lit by fluorescent bulbs instead of torches. Scientists examined him. They found signs of arthritis, dental wear, old age made visible in shriveled sinew. Yet the body remained a testament, not just to Egyptian mummification, but to the will of a man who refused to be forgotten. And in some surreal way, he wasn't. Modern Egyptologists read the inscriptions he ordered carved. Historians still analyze his wars, his monuments, his marriages. Children learn his name before they can place most modern rulers on a map. His likeness, carved in granite and sandstone, still stands, still watches, still waits. He had not conquered time, but he had spoken to it. In a world where so much disappears, voices lost, buildings gone, whole civilizations swallowed by sand, Ramesses remains. He remains in the columns of Luxor, where the sun still falls at the same angle each solstice. He remains in Abu Simbel, where tourists still gasp as dawn lights his face. He remains in the Vatican, the Louvre, the British Museum, pieces of him scattered, but not silenced. He remains in the myths, in debates, in dreams. Was he vain? Yes. Was he brilliant? Undoubtedly. But more than anything, he understood that memory is not given. It is built not once, but constantly, in stone, in story, in the eyes of those who follow. And so, Ramesses did not simply live a long life. He lived a long afterlife, one still unfolding. Today, in a museum in Cairo, his body lies behind glass, temperature controlled, carefully lit. Children press their noses to the glass, scholars murmur in awe, and the king, wrapped, silent, smiling faintly, speaks not with breath, but with presence. He says, "I was here, I mattered, I endured." And perhaps, in the hush of that moment, we hear him. We hear the chariots on the plains of Kadesh, the hammering of stone in temple halls, the soft laughter of Nefertari in moonlight, the sigh of a man watching the Nile, knowing the sun would rise again long after he did not. Ramesses the Great, Ramesses the Builder, Ramesses the living God, Ramesses who never truly died. Time humbles even empires. It wears down mountains, silences cities, and buries names beneath forgotten sands. But now and then, one name refuses to vanish. Ramesses, he was not the first king of Egypt. He was not the last. But he became something far rarer, the measure by which others were remembered. Pharaohs after him took his name, hoping to borrow his glow. Rulers beyond Egypt carved their own greatness in imitation of his, and historians, millennia later, still walk beneath his statues in reverent awe, tracing fingers along hieroglyphs that pulse with ancient breath. He was flawed, fierce, monumental. He loved deeply, ruled wisely, fought bravely. He held a civilization aloft, not only through conquest, but through belief in gods, in ritual, in the permanence of memory. And in doing so, he crossed a threshold few ever reach. He became myth in life and history, in death. Even now, when the world spins at speeds Ramesses could never imagine, his temples still stand. His mummy still rests. His story still whispers across the windswept stones of the Nile. He is gone, and yet everywhere. So when the sun rises over Egypt, golden and ancient, casting long shadows through the ruins of Karnak and Abu Simbel, listen, the air may carry an echo of chariot wheels, of prayers in the temple, of a voice calm and proud, saying simply, I was Pharaoh, I am still here.